Okay, there are two basic definitions you need when dealing with complex numbers. The first is that I, by definition, is equal to the square root of -1, and the second is that I squared is equal to -1. Whenever we have the chance to change an I squared into a -1, we do so. Looking at this first problem, we want to simplify the square root of -100. We begin by writing this as the square root of -1 times the square root of 100. The square root of -1 becomes I, and the square root of 100 becomes 10. And we write this as 10i. I is always lowercase and is written after its coefficient. The square root of -63 similarly can be written as the square root of -1 times the square root of 63. That gives us I times 3 root 7. Now we are supposed to write this as 3 root 7i, but some of us get a little bit crazy when we write our radicals and we go wee, and the I ends up being inside. So sometimes we rewrite this as 3i root 7, or preferred, as I wrote a moment ago, 3 root 7i. Either one of those perfectly acceptable as the way of writing this imaginary number. When we are multiplying imaginary numbers together, this is one property of real numbers that does not apply. This is not equal to the square root of 150. Okay, that would be a property of real numbers, that the square root of a times the square root of b is equal to the square root of ab. Instead, we want to write this as I root 10 times I root 15, and that gives us I squared root 150, and the I squared turns into a negative. The 150 turns out to be a 25 times 6, and the square root of 25 can be broken down into a 5 root 6. And this gives us -5 root 6. Had we simplified the square root of 150 instead, we would not have had the negative value that we do have here. When we're dealing with complex numbers, if we do not have the imaginary part, we can rewrite this as -4 plus 0i. Since the real numbers are a subset of the complex numbers, we can attach the imaginary number to the real number to create this complex number. In this next problem, which we want to simplify, we need to break down this 125. 125 is 25 times 5, and that will help us to reduce this radical. We are going to have -10 plus 5i root 5 all over 5. Now be careful with your canceling, because we must factor first. Factor a 5 out of that numerator to get -2 plus I root 5 all over 5, and then we can cancel those 5's. So we will have -2 plus I root 5, or better yet, -2 plus root 5i. We prefer to write these in a plus bi form whenever possible.